Okay, this is Canada's recognition of a state of Palestine and the Gaza ceasefire. What do these mean? What comes next? We just had introductions, and I'm sorry we didn't hit record before. I mentioned before I said the title of the event, so I'll apologize, Penelope and Layla. But the co-hosts are the Laboratory for Engaged Research and the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. We have our presenters with us, Ardi Imseis, Heidi Matthews, and Muhammad Shehada. And we have information on the Eventbrite that describe the bios for everybody and about the centers. So with with that being said, Ardi, can I hand it to you to take over from me?
Absolutely, Jeremy. Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, very audible.
Wonderful. Let me commence. Well, for many, it will seem absurd that anyone should discuss the recognition of Palestine at this particular moment. For as we gather, the putative sovereign of that state, the people of Palestine, is facing its most serious existential threat ever. In 2 years, Israel has killed or injured almost 240,000 Palestinians and counting, at least half of whom women and children. Tens of thousands or more are presumed dead under the rubble. Over 1.9 million have been forcibly transferred. That's almost 90% of the population of the Gaza Strip. And all of them have been subjected to an unrelenting campaign of carpet bombing, scorched earth, and starvation as methods of war. In January 2024, the International Court of Justice determined that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. And both before and since then, numerous other United Nations affiliated bodies, human rights organizations, and hundreds of international law and genocide specialists the world over have concluded that not only is the Gaza genocide plausible, but that ominous threshold has long been passed. Against this apocalyptic backdrop, one could be forgiven for wondering why recognition of the state of Palestine even matters. And this is especially so in light of the fact that many of the Western states, including Canada, that have recently recognized Palestine, appear to have made their recognition subject to certain conditions or qualifications. For instance, Canada's recognition is predicated on the so-called reform of the Palestinian Authority, the holding of general elections in 2026, the ensuring that Hamas takes no part in those elections and plays no role in the future government of Palestine, and that Palestine be a, quote, demilitarized state. Likewise, the United Kingdom's recognition of the state of Palestine was given only because the Israeli government failed to take substantive steps, and now I'm quoting the Prime Minister, substantive steps to end the appalling situation in Gaza, agree to a ceasefire, and commit to a long-term sustainable peace, reviving the prospect of a two-state solution, end quote. The UK, of course, also affirmed that Hamas must play no part in the governance of Gaza. And for its part, France restated the Canadian position, but not as conditions as such, but rather as undertakings apparently given by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. And so, in light of those commitments, France recognized the state of Palestine. Now, for any student of international relations and certainly international law, the problems with these express or implied conditions should be self-evident. As an international lawyer, for me, they signify a continuation of the West's long-held reluctance to take Palestine and Palestinians seriously, in accordance with the most basic principles of equity and morality, leave aside logic. For instance, how can the Palestinian Authority engage in reform or even hold elections if Israel continues its unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territory, including a ban on use by that authority of its own tax revenues, or the holding of Palestinian elections in the city of Jerusalem? Does this not place Israel in a position of holding a veto power over the recognition of the putative state of Palestine by Canada and its Western allies? Likewise, upon what authority do these Western states assert a right to dictate to the Palestinian people who they may or may not vote for or be governed by? Is that not a choice solely for the Palestinian people, who each of these Western states have long recognized as a right to political self-determination? Furthermore, In the face of an actual ongoing genocide against the Palestinian people, to say nothing of the decades-long apartheid regime that has given rise to it, by what legal, moral, or political authority do these Western states assert that the state of Palestine ought to be demilitarized? What of their so-called commitment to the principle that never again will such atrocity crimes be committed? And finally, how is it possible, in the case of the United Kingdom, that recognition can be held out as punishment for Israel's failure to respect its own obligations under international law? This is particularly galling in view of the historical responsibility that for the question of Palestine that the British themselves hold. So, if you, like me, are enraged by these apparent conditions or qualifications, certainly puzzled by them, the question arises, what can be done about it? In the realist world in which we live, recognition by these Western states has already occurred. But what might we do to ensure that a principled course correction is adopted going forward? Can international law be used to push back in this way, counter-hegemonically? In my view, the answer to this question is yes. And in this regard, three fundamental principles of international law must be borne in mind when considering the apparent qualified Western recognition of the state of Palestine and what it means in practice, both in law and politics. These three principles. First is the principle of non-intervention. This principle holds that no state may concern itself with the internal affairs of other states. This is nicely restated in Article 2, subsection 7 of the UN Charter. While the principle of non-intervention has been challenged in recent decades, most particularly with the notion of the so-called responsibility to protect, a responsibility, I should add, that has miraculously been forgotten by its Canadian authors when it comes to Gaza, there is no doubt that it prohibits foreign states from dictating how and by whom other peoples govern themselves. In this respect, any suggestion by Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and other Western allies that recognition is subject to certain conditions being undertaken by the Palestinian people vis-a-vis how and by whom they govern themselves is a clear violation of international law and does not bind Palestine in any way on the international plane, regardless of what the president of Palestine is alleged to have said or not said. Second, is the principle of territorial integrity and political independence of states. This principle holds that the state enjoys territorial sovereignty in a single territorial unit over which it exercises sovereignty to the exclusion of all other states. Political independence refers to the sovereignty exercised in the internal affairs of the state with respect to its institutions, freedom of political decision, policy making, and in matters pertaining to its domestic and foreign affairs. This principle is likewise restated in Article 2, subsection 4 of the UN Charter. As should be readily apparent, the conditions or qualifications of the Western states now recognizing Palestine do not hold up against the principle of territorial integrity and political independence that inheres in the state of Palestine that they have recognized. Third is the principle of self-defense. This customary principle, codified in Article 51 of the UN Charter, holds that all states possess an inherent right to use force in self-defense if subjected to an armed attack by another state. Such unlawful uses of force include illegal foreign military occupation and regimes of alien domination, subjugation, and exploitation, such as that which Israel has imposed on the Palestinian people, at least since 1967. Because each of these fundamental rules relate to or qualify as jus cogens norms of general international law, we call them peremptory norms, derogation from which is not permitted, they impose binding legal obligations on all states, including Canada, to ensure their protection. So fundamental are these norms that all states are said to have an interest in ensuring their respect. This means that to the extent that the Western powers now recognizing Palestine, including Canada, have purported to impose conditions or qualifications on that recognition that violate or aid or assist in the violation of these principles, those conditions have no legal validity whatsoever. It also means that recognition, and this is the most important point of my remarks today, that recognition without sustained and serious sanctions imposed on Israel will render such recognition merely symbolic. In this respect, two recent holdings of the International Court of Justice are of particular importance for the Western states now recognizing Palestine. I'll briefly touch on them and then I'll hand over. On 19 July 2024, in a case that derives in part from my own research and in which I had the privilege to serve as legal counsel to Palestine in, of course, I appear before you now in my personal capacity, the ICJ determined that Israel is not sovereign in the occupied Palestinian territory and that its continued settlement of the territory, among other policies and practices, violates three peremptory norms of general international law, namely the prohibition on territorial conquest, the obligation to respect the right of peoples to self-determination, and the obligation to refrain from imposing regimes of racial segregation and apartheid. The court accordingly determined that Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory is in and of itself unlawful, and that it is required to withdraw from the occupied territory unconditionally and as rapidly as possible, in the words of the court. The court further determined that all states have an obligation to bring Israel's presence in the occupied territory to an end, not to recognize Israel's continued presence in the occupied territory as lawful, nor, most importantly, to aid or assist Israel in the maintenance of its unlawful presence and actions in the occupied territory. In practical terms, this means that third states are under the obligation to completely alter their bilateral relations with Israel. If Israel is unable to reasonably demonstrate that the subject matter of the said relations between them and other states has nothing to do with its continued illegal presence in the occupied territory, which to my mind is a very high threshold, given the extent to which Israel has effectively annexed the territory, the obligation would then to alter those relations would then extend to the whole of Israel itself, not merely to Israel's physical presence in the occupied territory. This is particularly true of states like France, Canada, the United Kingdom, and other Western states who have close ties with Israel and who continue to furnish Israel with trade, political, military, economic, cultural assistance and cooperation, and so on. The fact that recognition has been extended by these Western states to the state of Palestine has only added weight to the pressure that can be brought to bear on them, that is to say, on Paris, on Ottawa, on London, and so on, to abide by their obligations, not to aid or assist Israel in maintaining its illegal presence in Palestine. Additionally, third states, including Canada, France, and the United Kingdom, cannot continue to justify Israel's unlawful presence in the occupied territory with any arguments, any at all, based on self-defense. As far back as 2004, the International Court of Justice determined that Israel may not rely on Article 51 of the UN Charter to respond to attacks that emanate from within the occupied Palestinian territory. Because Israel's presence in the OPT, the occupied territory, including the Gaza Strip, has now been determined by the International Court of Justice to be a violation of Article 2, subsection 4 of the UN Charter, it qualifies as an aggression. One result of this is that occupation cannot be justified by arguments of self-defense. Under international law, that is Israel's occupation. Under international law, there is no self-defense justification for aggression. Full stop. Quite the contrary. If any state enjoys a right of self-defense in this situation, it's the state of Palestine, not Israel. Because the state of Palestine enjoys an inherent right of self-defense and is the subject of an ongoing 58-year illegal use of force against it, being the illegal occupation, it can seek assistance from other states to help defend it from Israeli aggression, including those states who now recognize it. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that under the present political climate, Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and other Western states are going to send Palestine arms, materiel, and troops if Palestine exercised its sovereign right to request aid and assistance in self-defense from Israeli aggression, as the Ukrainians have, for instance, vis-a-vis Russia's aggression against them. But in principle, recognition of the state of Palestine opens the possibility for the argument to be made in Ottawa, Paris, London, Canberra, and other capitals in the West. And in this context, the legitimacy of the use of force, not only how force is used, international humanitarian law, but the legitimacy of the resort to force itself is a particularly important matter. Another relevant ruling of the ICJ was its binding determination on 26 January 2024 in the South Africa versus Israel case that Israel is plausibly engaged in genocide in the OPT. This triggered the obligation of all states parties to the Genocide Convention to do everything reasonably within their power to prevent genocide. Of course, these obligations already bind the Western states now recognizing the State of Palestine, including Canada, both under treaty law and as a matter of international custom. But by extending recognition, the scope of their obligations to do everything reasonably within their power to prevent genocide against the Palestinian people as a national group in their native land necessarily increases. They must therefore do much more to adjust their relationship with Israel than merely to recognize the State of Palestine and leave it at that. All of this to say in conclusion, in view of these cases and the erga omnes obligations that they impose on all third states, the recognition of Palestine by Western states like Canada, France, the United Kingdom, and others has actually opened up a window of opportunity. Recognition has increased avenues for pressure to be brought to bear on these Western states to alter their relationship with Israel. Now is precisely the time for all of us to press even harder for Western states that have recognized Palestine to impose full sanctions on Israel, diplomatic, economic, military, cultural, academic, and in other areas. Recognition has not in and of itself produced these legal obligations of third states vis-a-vis Israel, but there is no denying that recognition has increased the avenues of argument, both legal and political, that can help realize the change that is needed. They need to be exploited to the fullest. Otherwise, the justified fear that recognition will end up merely being symbolic may in fact come to pass. Thank you very much for your time. I'll hand it back to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Ardi. Heidi, can I hand it to you next to speak?
Yeah, thanks so much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great.
Perfect.
Okay, yeah, so I mean, I obviously agree with everything that Ardi has so wonderfully put just now. And so I think what my remarks will do briefly will be to kind of go back a little tiny bit, contextualize some of the shift that's actually signaled in terms of Canadian foreign policy with the move to recognition in relation to positions that Canada has held for some time and up until very recently with respect to the ICJ and its exercise of discretionary jurisdiction to issue advisory opinions, and then to kind of evaluate this question of are these conditions, are they stipulations, are they some kind of other thing, right? How to characterize the nature specifically of Canada's statement of recognition that Ardi has already gone through in detail with regard to the so-called conditions, and then to kind of just conclude really briefly with respect to the relationship of the act of recognition to Canada's more recent, very enthusiastic, it seems, endorsement of Trump's so-called Gaza peace plan, whatever is going on there. So yeah, so I would just say that to begin, Canada's active recognition signals a fairly significant departure. I mean, a very significant, right? And not to endorse significance here as a normative category, but just to say that actually the shift in terms of foreign policy is significant. It's a departure from Canada's longstanding policy, both legally expressed and otherwise, that was committed, vaguely to this idea of a two-state solution, but also committed very firmly, and Ardi discusses this at length in his book, also very firmly committed to the idea that such a solution could only come about on the basis of, direct negotiation between the parties. And so self-determination, understood as Palestine's right to a free and independent state was something that would be effectively negotiated. As recently as July 2023, Canada put this in writing, specifically in the context of its written observations to the ICJ in the advisory opinion on the legality or unlawfulness of the occupation that Ardi has just described for us. And so in those written observations, and I just to note, I always note this, is it's fascinating to me that Canada ultimately refrained from taking up the invitation to present these observations in person at the ICJ when the hearings came about, of course, in the aftermath of October 2023. Anyway, so Canada put this in writing, but wasn't, it very soon became unwilling to sort of stand in the international stage and actually repeat this. But in any event, it didn't retract its observations. It objected to the court's exercise of jurisdiction in that advisory opinion. Again, quote, and this is from the written observations, it just bears quoting directly, on the basis that Canada, quote, believes direct dialogue between the parties themselves is the best path rather to create the conditions for peace, right? Canada is concerned that the issuance of an advisory opinion may contribute to a polarization of positions that would risk moving the parties further away from a just and lasting resolution to the conflict, right? So a very particular sort of framing that starts to dissolve quite soon after October 2023. The opinion that was eventually issued made it clear in July 2024 that all third states, as Ardi has said, were, among other things, obligated to ensure that any impediment resulting from the continued unlawful presence of Israel in the OPT, specifically with respect to the exercise of the Palestinian people's right of self-determination, is brought to an end. And the court actually specified outright that the realization of that inalienable, most basic of human rights to self-determination, including, quote, Palestine's right to an independent and sovereign state, living side by side in peace with the state of Israel, would contribute to regional stability and security of all states in the Middle East. And so what I find fascinating about this kind of pronouncement in the course of the advisory opinion itself is that the court is kind of taking a form, I think, of judicial notice, right? A sort of political fact-finding, let's say, of the idea that there will be no peace without recognition, which effectively reverses the long-standing Canadian view that I've just described, which was that there should be no recognition without peace, right? And so we get this this kind of conceptual, but also political and legal reversal of the order of that logic. And so now, in the course of Canada's statement on recognition, we see, and this is again comes directly from the statement itself, that, quote, security can only ultimately be guaranteed through the achievement of a comprehensive two-state solution. So I think actually, as insufficient for the reasons Ardi has explained, recognition is without more fulsome compliance with a wide variety of international legal obligations, including pragmatically through the imposition of a full two-way arms embargo, full sanctions, etc. I think this conceptual shift is important to remark on. So now we have a situation where Canada is sort of, at least on paper, right, so far, markedly altered its course. It now says that the possibility of a two-state solution, bracketing that for a moment in terms of feasibility, the idea that that possibility can be premised on a negotiated settlement has now been steadily eroded, and those are the words that are used in the statement itself. And so while the statement does a lot of problematic kind of both sidesism in the sense that it allocates blame for this reality, i.e. the steady erosion of the capacity for a negotiated two-state solution, is in part put at the feet of Hamas, right? Including, according to Canada, Hamas's longstanding violent rejection, this is from the statement itself, of Israel's right to exist in a two-state solution, I do think it's worth just pausing for a moment on how strident the statement is, as well in its criticism of Israel and Israeli policies. So Canada notes that, quote, the current Israeli government is working methodically to prevent the prospect of a Palestinian state from ever being established. It goes on, it says, it is now the avowed policy of the current Israeli government that there will be no Palestinian state. So the criticism is, compared to what we see, again, just taking as a kind of documentary piece of history with the written observations in July 2023, a very different language and very different conceptual framing. In terms of the question of like actually ending the genocide, right, which is related to but distinct from the prospects of ensuring a fully independent state that has all the attributes of sovereignty, including, as Ardi has mentioned, full access to a monopoly on the use of force, etc. There are other components that I think are worth mentioning in terms of what a robust Canadian foreign policy would look like alongside the move to recognition. And so, look, Canadian lawyers and activists, civil society representatives, and others, academics, et cetera, have been calling on the government to take, for 2 years now or more, calling on the government to take a series of discrete policy moves to affect that outcome. Recognition is one of those, but even recognition itself, right, is held to be fairly meaningless unless Canada were then to take kind of the extra step at the level of the United Nations itself to actually militate or act affirmatively in favor of Palestine gaining full membership in the UN. But the other four I'll just mention briefly. Actually achieving full humanitarian access, which despite the so-called ceasefire has, of course, not happened. Publicly supporting the role of international courts, including the ICJ and the ICC, in holding violators to account. Canada has recently, or Prime Minister Carney has recently stated that he would actually arrest Netanyahu were he to enter Canada, but I think we still need a more fulsome statement of commitment to compliance in that respect. And a range of domestic measures, right? Including, revoking the free trade agreement, right? The sanctions that have already been mentioned, investigating in a real way, right? Violations of the Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes Act, et cetera, stripping organizations of charitable status who are complicit in war crimes. And then, of course, working, and I think this is the most important one that I'll come back to at the end, working actively towards an immediate and permanent ceasefire, which I don't think we can say that we have right now. So as hopeful, maybe, what I've just noted in terms of the degree or the markedness of the shift in foreign policy, I think the impact of the Canadian recognition is constrained by two main factors. One, the so-called conditional nature of the recognition that's been described. I'll unpack that a little bit. And then secondly, the inconsistency of the nature of Canada's active recognition with Canada's support for the Trump whatever plan we're going to call it, right? So on the conditionalness, it's already been noted, the recognition is not of a State of Palestine simpliciter, but of a state led by a particular government with a particular political orientation. Ardi's gone through that in detail. I don't need to repeat it. I think, strictly speaking, it's probably wrong, and so I'm revised my own initial thoughts on this, probably wrong to think about these like appendages to the act of recognition as conditions in a legally enforceable sense, right? Or as something akin to a condition that would be attached to a private law contract. And so I think it might be more helpful actually just to kind of question the conditional nature of the recognition in the first place, right? So these are like forward-looking promises of some kind, right? Attempts to exact outcomes related to the act of recognition itself. But the question from an enforceability perspective, right, would be A, what would it mean were the Palestinian Authority or, whoever is constituting the government of the State of Palestine were not to comply with some of these stipulations, including around things like full demilitarization, et cetera? Would that mean that there's some kind of breach of an international obligation, right? A, and then B, what would the effect of that be? Would Canada somehow be entitled as a legal matter? A political matter, I think, would be a separate question, but as a legal matter to then revoke or rescind or modify the act of recognition in some sense? And I think the answer to both those questions is quite clearly no. So, firstly, Canada announced the so-called conditions about 6 weeks, I think, before the actual act of recognition took place in September. So it was in the summer. It was clear at that point that the conditions were unfeasible if they were to be considered conditions, right, that needed to be met before the recognition were to take place. So obviously, right, elections were not going to be held, massive reforms weren't going to happen by September, there wasn't going to be demilitarization, Hamas was not going to have been totally destroyed, right? So completely unfeasible as a practical matter. And so how then are we to understand the effect of their requirements in terms of a failure to meet them at some future point in time, which is not specified and which is now after the actual act of recognition has taken place. And so I went back and read a very, to the extent this is helpful, went back and read an old article by Lauterpacht on the idea of conditional conditional state recognition, and it turns out that it's not a thing, right? So in the sense that recognition, so we want to think about this theoretically, recognition is a matter of responding factually to already constituted political authority, right? And I think partly what Ardi is getting at in terms of the problematic nature, and I agree with him on this, of course, of these so-called conditions or stipulations or promises or political provisos or whatever, is that they're effectively an attempt on the part of these Western states, including Canada, to serve in a role analogous to like constitutive authority itself, right? So it's the attempt to actually decide for the state of Palestine what authority will actually substantively look like, right? And to impact, as Ardi has said, I think quite rightly, to have not only an impact, but an unlawful impact in the sense of an impermissible and unjustified infringement on the political integrity of the political body in question, right? So for Lauterpacht, at least, such stipulations are sometimes made, not regularly, but when they are made, they don't tend to function as contractual conditions in the sense that failure to meet them would be considered some kind of breach owed to a recognizing state. And in that sense, so-called conditional recognition is simply inconsistent, and these are Lauterpacht's words, with the true purpose of recognition, which is the ascertainment and declaration of the existence of certain factual requirements of statehood, right? And so viewed that way, from a legal perspective at least, I think it's totally fair to say that there's no like enforceability at all attached to the conditionality of Canada's or other Western states' recognition, and we should just be very, very upfront about that it's just a sense, in some senses, like political maneuvering and an attempt to have an impact internally, but not any kind of legally enforceable demand, right? So, in other words, failure to fulfill any of these political stipulations cannot be considered a ground for retracting recognition later on. That, I think, is something that the legal community can make clear to the government as a political matter moving forward, to the extent that we're able to do that. Just to reinforce part of what Ardi has already said, just as self-determination, which is a peremptory or a jus cogens norm of international law, cannot be made the subject matter of negotiation per the advisory opinion, but also per established international law, recognition itself cannot be treated as a bargaining chip, and any other position would effectively mark, I think, a continuation of Canada's previously patronizing and also unlawful view that Palestinian self-determination is in some sense negotiable. So I'll just quickly conclude with inconsistency with the ceasefire plan, right? So in its statement on recognition, Canada said that, quote, it supports the development of a credible peace plan, right? So it's very vague sort of thing. Looking back, reading the events of the past weeks backward, I think there was some sense on the part of Carney and his government that that was coming in the form of what we now see as the Trump peace plan, which Carney has enthusiastically endorsed. And so specifically, Carney made the following statement. He said, the Gaza Peace Summit is an historic moment, one that opens a new chapter of hope, blah, blah, blah. The roads to stability and peace remains long, but this is a vital first step. And so I would say recognition may be considered a vital first step. But the nature of this peace plan is so inconsistent with basic commitments around, or to rather, substantively to self-determination, that it's difficult, if not impossible, to conceptually and politically square these two events. And so two things to note, there are others, but the nature of the so-called plan is not about vesting actual governmental authority with Palestinians at all, but talks about a technocratic board that's being overseen, by the Board of Peace being led by Donald Trump and maybe Tony Blair, maybe somebody else, we're not really sure, et cetera, right? And that also demilitarization is a core part of the plan, and for reasons that have been mentioned, it's simply inconsistent with the idea of what it means to be a fully fledged, functioning, independent state, but also inconsistent with what the act of recognition actually means in terms of a political notation of facts on the ground, as opposed to an attempt to engage to alter the nature of the political arrangements that will take place in a newly constituted, or at least newly recognized state. Yeah, so I think I'll leave it there. Thank you for the invitation, and the other speakers.
Thanks, Heidi. That's fantastic. I'm going to make a quick note. I keep, because we had to shorten the beginning of the event, I keep dropping the bios for everyone in the chat if you want to see their bios. And another quick note, when we finish up around a bit after 1 with after Muhammad speaks next, we'll switch to a question and answer. It'll be a little bit brief. I am noting that people are asking questions right now in the question and answer box, and Ardi keeps answering. So you might want to check that out. Muhammad.
Thank you so much, Jeremy, my friend. Good to see you again after seeing each other in Canada recently. Jeremy and I have known each other now for over 6 years, I think. And I always enjoy our discussions and your work. I'll try to focus on two things that were given to me. Number one, the recognition of Palestine. The other one is the ceasefire now. And I think there is a very solid link between the two, in the sense of being a Potemkin ceasefire and a Potemkin recognition. Potemkin being the Russian ruler that established a fake village, a facade, to impress the Empress, Catherine, and show her a different reality from the actual reality of the peasants on the ground. And it was very funny the way they did it. They would establish this facade of a village across the river bay as she sailed through. And as soon as her ship was off, they would dismantle it and run as fast as they can and set it up again a few kilometers and do it all over and over again. And you see this happening with both the recognition and the Trump peace plan. The recognition, to start with, what is it that Western countries recognize in the first place? I would say they recognized what would have been the dream of apartheid South Africa. Apartheid South Africa tried very desperately to get international recognition for the Bantustans, while maintaining the Bantustans as Potemkin areas, or basically maintaining them as vassal states. And that is the Palestinian state that Canada, other European countries have recognized. It's a state that has no ability to defend itself, as earlier speakers elaborated in detail, a state that has no sovereignty in terms of who's allowed to run for elections, who's allowed to rule the government, who's allowed to dictate and decide and hold power in that government. You already have the clear red lines about Hamas not being allowed, as well as presumably all other parties that would fit in the same category as Hamas, which means the Palestine Liberation Front, the Palestine Democratic Front, the Palestine Islamic Jihad, etc. Any party that recognizes the right to armed resistance would be disqualified. So it would end up being Fatah and a camouflaged list of other either minion parties, a one-person party. We have a whole bunch of these. If you look, for example, there's a party called the Jabhat al-Nidal al-Sha'bi. It's a party of one person. that person is a minister in the Palestinian Authority government, because it looks nice when they have a whole bunch of those one-person party in the government to give it the appearance of plurality and diversity. Or it would be the banned parties themselves, like Hamas and others, competing in the elections with campaigns that do not bear their name or any of their confirmed members, so people sympathetic to the group. In other words, there is a clear manipulation of how Palestinians are to elect their own leaders. Which leaders do they choose? And it's very much deja vu of 2006, when you had Palestinians, not a majority, it was about 43% of the Palestinian public voting for Hamas, mainly as an angry vote. It was a protest vote because of Israel doing two things: humiliating its advocated and proclaimed peace partner, the Palestinian Authority, and bankrupting it. And on the other side, the other thing was the alleged withdrawal from Gaza that basically had the immediate impact of Israel shutting down the Palestinian economy by preventing over 100,000 Gazan workers from access to the labor market in Israel and the West Bank, which caused what Sarah Roy, the economist at Harvard University, said at the time was the worst economic depression in modern history. And as soon as Hamas won their election, mainly again on a protest vote, it was a campaign that they ran on, quote, reform and change, economic reform and anti-corruption. And as soon as they won, you had an immediate campaign from the US and Israel to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the Palestinian public for voting the wrong people. That's how democracy works. You're supposed to vote only for the people that we like. But I think what was very telling about this is basically you would have a demilitarized state with Europe and Canada and Western countries dictating who sits in government and who does not, who enjoys legitimacy and who is banned. And the third element is no symptoms of autonomy whatsoever or sovereignty. And it is predicated on the earlier outlines of Palestinian-Israeli negotiations, the top of which was the Mahmoud Abbas-Ehud Olmert agreement. It did not produce a solid agreement at the end because Olmert ended up in prison, but the outline was basically the most realistic proposal for Palestinian statehood is that the state would not have any control over its sea space, its airspace, over its borders. There would be an Israeli presence alongside the Jordanian Valley, and that presence would be replaced by NATO or American troops or other international troops, but no control over our own borders. And of course, not even control over the telecommunication space, because Israel said that that might interfere with the radio signals of the army. So a vessel state, first and last, or a Potemkin state. At the same time, it's very telling the panicking reaction that you got from Israel was something that is giving Israel its dream scenario of a Palestinian Hong Kong. And the Israeli reaction from the very left to the very right, from the parties in the opposition, except for the Arab members of the Knesset, the parliament, each single one of them issued a statement either condemning Netanyahu or condemning the recognition or condemning both and describing it as a failure. If you are an Israeli and you have the international community saying we recognize Palestinians' claim only on 22% of their historic homeland, and it would be a vassal state, a minion state that you get to dictate and control in every sense of the word, it would be completely economically dependent on you, politically, security, etc., full dependency on Israel. The Israelis should be dancing and rejoicing. Instead, the panicking reaction, it came specifically out of two concerns. Number one is the concern of a different or a counter idea to the notion that Netanyahu was trying to spread around with his Western allies, that the only humane solution to the Palestinian question is mass expulsion. And Israel, until this very moment, is still very much invested in that scenario, what they call the voluntary migration from Gaza. And number two, it's because Israel was afraid of a snowballing effect, that this is a taboo. Once you have Western governments recognizing the state of Palestine, then the second question that follows is, what are you going to do to get that state realized? And the Israelis were very afraid of having that conversation because it would expose which party is the one that is opposing the two-state solution. But as soon as we had recognition unfolding, Israel's concerns were assuaged within the matter of hours, at most days, because they didn't see any snowballing effect whatsoever. they realized that this was mainly about damage control. So immediately on the day that France recognized Palestine, I was in a meeting with the French Foreign Ministry. And the question that everyone in the room kept asking is, okay, very nice that you recognize this now. What are you going to do next? Nothing. The French counterparts, they told us literally, the head of the French delegation in the room said, you have to go now, open champagnes, rejoice and celebrate. And in the back of my head, I have family in Gaza under genocide that Israel has reduced into rats, scurrying for shelter and food. Run here, and then you get bombed in the area that you ran to. Run there, and then you get bombed over there. Wherever you ran, you get bombed. And that guy is saying, celebrate with champagne and rejoice. And every time we said, okay, what about banning settlement products? What about a diplomatic mission? What about this and that? No answer at all, none whatsoever. Sanctions were the least thing they wanted to hear, because recognition was precisely the sort of antithesis to the sanction discourse. Western governments wanted a performative measure to save face with their internal audiences, and they thought very hard which of them is it going to be, sanctioning 2 Israeli ministers symbolically and isolating them as stereotypical caricaturial evil and blaming everything on them, namely Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, or recognizing Palestine. And sanctioning 2 ministers apparently was a step too far for many Western governments. They settled for the recognition instead. You saw this immediately when the ceasefire in Gaza was announced. As soon as it was announced, Europe was supposed to have 2 meetings on the topic of sanctions. And at both times, the majority of European member states were saying we should not disrupt peace, we should give peace a chance, we should not impose any sanctions. And sanctions were killed immediately in that room. There's the other argument that I heard repeatedly from Canada, for example, or other European governments, is that it is up to Palestinians and Israelis to figure it out. They have to talk to each other, they have to negotiate, and let's see how things work. I once engaged in a sort of a very detailed discussion on that particular topic with an American diplomat from a security background. And his point of view was, you should stop asking Europe or the US or the UN to intervene. It's not going to work. It's not going to happen. You need to figure it out with the Israelis yourself. And I retorted by saying, okay, we're happy to do so on 2 conditions. Number one, if we try to figure it out with the Israelis, don't sanction the International Criminal Court. Don't intimidate the judges at the International Court of Justice, because we need arbitration. We cannot settle on a final conclusion to the conflict. We need a court to decide who's right and who's wrong, who gets what and who doesn't. Don't delegitimize any of those things, and stop vetoing resolutions at the UN Security Council, because otherwise you're not leaving it to the both of us. You are not leveling the playing field. It's rather the opposite. And the second condition is stop delegitimizing Palestinian resistance in all its forms, even non-violence, even advocacy, even sanctions, even BDS boycotts, divestment, sanctions, all of it. If you look at BDS, it's called economic terrorism in both Israel and the US government. I think in Canada, it might be increasingly delegitimized in the same lane. If you look at Palestinian advocacy, it is called PR terrorism. If you look at Palestinian NGOs, they're called Palestinian terrorists in suits. If you look at Palestinian diplomacy, it's called diplomatic terrorism. Even if you go on a hunger strike in a Palestinian prison, it's called hunger terrorism or terrorism in prison. If you go and protest non-violently, it's again called PR terrorism to make Israel look bad. It's called asymmetrical warfare. If you try even to build a home on Palestinian land, it's called construction terrorism. So if you want us to figure it out between the both of us, give us a free hand to resist, to fight back. Something like Ukraine. It is always baffling the way that you see Western governments sort of rejoicing, relishing in the killing of Russian soldiers, in the attacks on the Russian army, even in the attacks on Russian state assets, oil facilities, government facilities. They look at it with such immense satisfaction. They applaud it as heroism. You can never even begin to think about the opposite scenario when it comes to Palestinians. So the question is always, okay, if you want us to figure it out between the both of us, on what terms? Like, if you are a Palestinian, what would you do? What would you do? What would you do differently that Palestinians are not doing at the moment? And I posed that question to a top European Union leader repeatedly. I asked it 3 times in the same meeting. First 2 times he didn't answer. The third time he resigned in his chair and he said, there's nothing Palestinians can do. There's nothing Palestinians can do. There's nothing. And he kept repeating it mindlessly. He said, they tried everything. There's nothing they can do. Now, the last point about statehood is basically this European discourse. When they recognized the state of Palestine, or Canada as well, they tried to package it as much as possible as a gift to Israel. They were trying to tell Israel, okay, we are your best friends possible, and we are doing this for your own interest, for your own long-term security. You had Emmanuel Macron going to do multiple interviews with Israeli media. One of them was with Channel 12, the main Israeli television, and I think it lasted about 90 minutes, if not more. And the same point that he's driving over and over again, he's begging the Israelis to understand that recognizing Palestine is for Israel's sake, to break its international isolation, to improve its standing internationally, to revive a dead paradigm of the two states that Israel has killed with multiple nails in the coffin. I've lost count of how many times I've heard the statement from the US government, the Canadian government, the international community saying this would be the last nail in the coffin if Israel does A or if Israel does B. And then you get Israel doing A, B, C, D until all the entire alphabet, including the Nordic alphabet, going extra mile about the nails in the coffin. And there's nothing that happens after. There's still the mirage of the two-state solution as a possibility. It is, of course, until now, it is physically possible. Everything is reversible, even though you have a growth of Israeli settlements deliberately resembling a cancerous tumor that is spreading throughout the human organs, the human body in the West Bank. If you just take a look at it, it's between every town and the neighboring town, between every village and the neighboring village. There's an Israeli settlement situated there strategically. But even despite those settlements, it is physically possible. It is politically impossible because you cannot name a single Israeli politician that would publicly say, we need to move to the two-state solution. I will sign a peace agreement without losing the popular vote or losing their positions. It became one of the reasons why Israel's propaganda became such garbage for the last 2 years, is that they've lost the ability to even fake, to pretend to care for Palestinians. If an Israeli diplomat or an Israeli government spokesperson or politician says in an interview with foreign media that Palestinians are human and we want peace with them, we believe in the two-state solution, they would end up without any job by the end of the day. They would lose their jobs immediately. It's called career suicide or political suicide in Israel because of how extreme the discourse has moved. In Germany, I asked the foreign ministry there, okay, so what is it, your policy on Israel? They said, our policy is to tell the Israelis that we are your best friends ever. We are the closest friends that you will ever have. So when the hour of truth hits, they would listen to us when we give them advice and say, this is not good for you. And I asked, okay, how does it work when you try to give them that advice? Like the hour of truth has been ringing for the past 2 years. How do they react? And the guy said, they become very hostile. They become very frantic. They bring up our Nazi past, etc. So I tried to drive the point that there's nothing you can do to get the Israelis to like you if you support Palestinian rights, not even 1%. If you take a look, for example, at Joseph Borrell, the EU High Representative, the previous one, in every speech since October 7th, he made sure to mention his life in a kibbutz in Israel, and that's where he met his first partner, his first wife. He made sure to mention it over and over again. He made sure to condemn October 7th with every breath that he took. And as soon as he mentioned that Israel was going too far in Gaza with weaponizing food, Israel, from the very left to the very right, condemned him as an anti-Semite. It was, in fact, an Israeli diplomat that told me to my face that even Labor Meretz voters in the foreign ministry in Israel think that Joseph Borrell is an anti-Semite. There's no way you can get them to like you and then push them to do things differently by getting them to like you. But I asked the Germans, okay, it was very fascinating to me the way that when the ceasefire broke down, the EU condemned Hamas for Israel banning food, water, electricity, medicine, and bombing Gaza with an opening strike that killed 300 people. The EU statement came out and said the ceasefire broke down. That was around March this year. The ceasefire broke down. We condemn Hamas strongly. We call on Hamas to re-engage in talks with Israel. And it was even more baffling when we saw the escalation between Israel and Iran, when Israel bombed Iran without notice, And then you got the EU condemning Iran for getting bombed by Israel. And I asked the Germans, I said, when the US invaded Iraq, you condemned the invasion of Iraq. You refused to take part in it. Why didn't you do it this time around? It's called a war of aggression when a country goes and bombs another country unprovoked. And they said it's because Israel is the one that did it. If the US was the one that bombed Iran, we would have condemned the US. And then I asked a follow-up question to another German interlocutor. I said, what is the threshold after which you would condemn Israel? When would Israel go too far in your perspective? And he literally said, if Israel bombs Berlin tomorrow, we would have to condemn Berlin and applaud Israel. So basically, like the human capacity for self-deception is bottomless. One argument that they bring up to justify this kind of lunacy is that they say if we condemn Israel publicly, it would make the ceasefire negotiations more difficult because Hamas would become more hardline and more uncompromising, and they would require more concessions from the Israelis. So we need to keep no daylight between us and Israel in order to make the ceasefire happen, in order to maintain the pressure on Hamas. And then you had a documentary in Israel's Channel 13 saying that Hamas agreed to the ceasefire in April 2024 and agreed to it again in July 2024 and agreed to it again in January this year. And it was the Israelis and the Biden administration that were procrastinating and preventing ceasefire from happening. But again, the human capacity for self-deception is really bottomless. And it's the same with the ceasefire in Gaza. And that's my concluding remark. You have Trump claiming that he ended a 3,000-year-old conflict that predates the existence of Islam. For some reason, he thinks that we go back that far in history. And you have Europe, Canada, etc., going along with that pretense and pretending that the genocide in Gaza is over. And the vested interest in this is basically to take off any talk about sanctions or accountability whatsoever, that now is the time of peacemaking, and any sanctions would disrupt that very fragile peace. But if you look at the peace on the ground, again, it's a Potemkin peace. What you have is basically Israel, from the very first moment the ceasefire was signed, killed over 200 Palestinians, including yesterday, 100 yesterday alone, within 12 hours, which means you had now a ceasefire going for less than 20 days. So you have an average of about 12 Palestinians killed per day. If you have that amount of people killed in Canada, you would call it a mass shooting or a massacre. You would have a national day of mourning. It would be all over the news. In Gaza, it doesn't make any headlines. If you look, for example, at Trump's announcement versus the reality on the ground, Trump said reconstruction in Gaza would begin immediately. Until now, Israel is not even allowing bulldozers to clear the rubble in Gaza. They're not allowing even tents or caravans or housing, prefabricated housing units or containers, not even metal containers. Although we are approaching winter and the overwhelming majority of the population in Gaza is now homeless on the street. And Israel is still, until now, restricting the amount of food that's going into Gaza dramatically and not opening up Gaza's main gateway to the world, the Rafah border crossing, for people to cross in and out, or for international journalists in specific to go into Israel. And you have it all over Israeli media. They're very openly saying, we are not ready for the day when journalists get into Gaza because of the amount of damage, destruction, and carnage that they will witness. And they're trying to prepare propaganda material already from now, and lots of different arguments to give to those journalists mandatory before they go into Gaza. One of those arguments is to say that underneath every single home in Gaza, there was a tunnel. There was a Hamas command and control center. I kid you not, this is literally the Israeli argument. And that they would show this CGI maps to journalists before they go into Gaza, so that when they see the vast destruction, they will think it's the result of warfare, combat, and clashes between Hamas and Israel. The last point is basically yesterday's carnage. What we saw is explained in one metaphor. Trump has put a dog leash around Netanyahu's neck. That dog leash is very loose. It gives the Israelis a huge room of maneuver. They can get away with a lot. They can violate the ceasefire repeatedly. Until yesterday, they had violated it about 125 times. But they are not allowed from collapsing the ceasefire officially. They're not allowed from moving troops into the 42% of Gaza that is now not occupied by Israel. 58% is depopulated, occupied, and declared as an annihilation zone or extermination zone. Nobody is allowed to cross in there. There's now an invisible yellow barrier that looks, that resembles the Berlin Wall. Anybody that comes in close proximity is shot, bombed, or kidnapped. But Netanyahu is trying to do two things. He's trying to pull Trump towards him. He's trying to build up a case for resuming what he calls military pressure on Hamas. In other words, resuming the genocide in order to get more wiggle room. So he's showing Netanyahu, for example, arguments about Hamas not retrieving the full count of bodies of Israeli dead hostages in Gaza. Although it was very clear in the ceasefire negotiations that this would take a very long time because there's 50 million tons of rubble in Gaza at the moment, and it would take until the year 2050 to clear that rubble alone before any talk about reconstruction. And the last thing Netanyahu is trying to do is chew on that leash to break loose and resume the genocide and go on a rampage, as we saw yesterday, with Israel using the flimsiest pretext possible. A single soldier killed in Rafah, presumably either by friendly fire or running over unexploded ordnance or encountering an isolated, trapped Hamas cell in their area that has no knowledge of the ceasefire taking place, has no contact with the rest of the Hamas leadership in Gaza, because they are in an area that is controlled solely by the IDF and depopulated. And Israel rushed to say, this is a Hamas attack on us, and we need to retaliate. And the retaliation was killing 46 children, 104 people in Gaza last night. And we're going to see this happen over and over again, while you have official government pretending otherwise. So it becomes both the Palestinian statehood and the ceasefire becomes like Schrodinger's cat. It depends on the perspective of who's looking. And unfortunately, the people looking at this are just pretending to be blind when it comes to Western governments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Muhammad. So some optimism and a lot of pessimism amongst the speakers. Just because we had a later start, I'm wondering if we can keep the last 10 minutes to a simple question I'm going to ask that in part inspired this event, talking with Ardi last month. And then closing thoughts from each speaker and maybe about 3 minutes each, if that's okay, just responding to each other and what we've said here. So my main question is just what can Canadians and let's say Canadian advocates in particular do now that the recognition has happened, or regardless of it, even thinking of you, Muhammad, and what you might advise Canadians. And then if you can just end with your own closing thoughts, about 3 minutes each.
Or shall I begin?
Please, Ardi. Yeah, sorry, in the same order that we went.
That sounds good. Look, I don't think any one of us would, well, I can only speak for myself. I don't disagree with any of the analysis offered by Muhammad. I think he's erudite, he's eloquent, he's thorough. His is a testament that every Palestinian on earth, including me and others, can easily and always have made, that must be taken into account as we understand where we should go next. And it is a hard, cold fact that we must all agree with, or rather that we must face. This is the racist world. Nobody supports the Palestinian people. Nobody. By which I mean political elites. If 23 months of genocide has not demonstrated to us, during the course of which not a single Arab state that has diplomatic relations with Israel has withdrawn their diplomatic presence from Tel Aviv, if that does not demonstrate to us that the Palestinian people stand on their own when it comes to the political elites in the world around us, I don't know what does. There have been some really important moves made by some states, South Africa, Nicaragua, certainly the Spanish. Colombia has made pronouncements of wanting to contribute troops and other such. But the vast majority of states on planet Earth that have the political will and indeed the obligation to prevent genocide, or indeed to do nothing to aid or assist Israel in the continued presence of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory and so on, have done nothing. So it's a hard and cold world. So I share Muhammad's analysis. However, and this goes to your question, Jeremy, I don't think and I only speak for myself here, have the liberty of being angry alone. But I think we need to do what we can to take whatever measures we can on the basis of the hard, cold world we live in, and quit the blinkered eyes and thinking that somehow if we critique the world enough, the other side that is shooting at us and other such and supporting it will somehow see the error of their ways. That's not going to happen. Nobody's going to come to the rescue of the Palestinian people. What is going to happen, by which I mean the political elites, what can happen, what must happen, is that the state of Palestine, the Palestinian people, wherever they are, need to open up whatever action is possible to add pressure on the apartheid, fascistic, genocidal regime and their supporters, and to do so relentlessly. And to my mind, it's easy for us to look at the symbolism of recognition as one such piece, right? But it also offers opportunities to press, boycott, divestment, sanction. One might say, likewise, and I'm an international lawyer and I do this work at the ICJ and all of that. One might say, what are you wasting your time for, Professor Imseis? The ICJ has no ability to enforce its own orders, as is demonstrated over the past couple of years with what's going on in the South Africa matter, leave aside other cases. And I would have to admit that that is true. That is one of the failings of international law and the international legal order. But at the same time, we must also see value in that, because those legal pronouncements, much like Muhammad had mentioned earlier, when in his invocation of the prospect of trying to adjudicate or have some form of assessment, a neutral assessment of any bilateral engagement with Israel, those legal pronouncements matter because they set out politically what is regarded as legitimate on the international plane. That is not to say that law or any single BDS action is going to liberate the Palestinian people from their turmoil. No, not at all. But at the same time, liberation won't happen. Freedom will not happen if each and every one of these opportunities is not exploited to the fullest. So my only piece of advice to colleagues and friends, comrades who might be listening to this, Canadians, do not despair. There's much reason to do so. You don't have the liberty of doing so. Press on. Recognition offers an entry point to put pressure on Ottawa to do the right thing when they don't want to. And when the other side and their lobbyists in the country are going to ensure that they don't do, we do not have the liberty of doing that. So what can be done? First and foremost, advocate for the end, the abrogation of the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, which defines Israel territory as including the occupied Palestinian territory. This runs counter to basic principles of international law concerning the territorial integrity and political independence and the obligation not to interfere in the internal affairs of a state that has been recognized by Canada, the State of Palestine. This is a violation of basic principles of international treaty law. Treaties that violate these principles, again, use Kogan's norms, that prohibit territorial conquest, are void from the outset, void ab initio, as we say. And so the Canadian government needs to have pressure put on it to end its bilateral trade agreement with Israel. This is part of a larger piece that hopefully, if enough states, elites, and others do, will help mitigate the impact of Israel's viciousness on the Palestinian people. I say mitigate, I don't say liberate. It will take a whole lot more to do that. Let's be realists about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ardi. Heidi.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I really have that much to add to what was so wonderfully put. Some of those policy points I'd mentioned in my remarks. I mean, I think from the perspective of, you can talk about the ordinary Canadian, or the Canadian professional in one respect or another. And just as Ardi has said, I mean, there's just simply an obligation on an individual level to exert the pressure to press the levers that are available to each of us, and that will look different for everybody. But everybody does have capacity and does have a role to play. And so I would say as well that connected to that is the willingness to be able to frankly take risks in terms of one's own sense of stability versus precarity in the world, because my experience and my sense is that before the mitigation happens, as already helpfully said, the repression will intensify in terms of academic freedom, freedom of speech, et cetera. And so pressure the government, but also various arms of government or government associated nodes of power, including our journalists, right? Including the CBC. We've seen some movement recently in terms of the degree to which places like the CBC are willing to cover Canadian complicity in the genocide, in the continued unlawful occupation, et cetera. But a sustained amount of pressure in all of those places and in all of the relevant professions is simply required and not an option for any of us to do otherwise. Thanks.
Thanks, Muhammad.
Yep, I'll connect to a point that Heidi made about the Canadian media. And a funny point nonetheless, it's basically as soon as the ceasefire was announced and Hamas did the security crackdown immediately after, my phone didn't stop ringing from invitations from every single mainstream media outlet that has been systematically deplatforming Palestinians. CBC was one of them, CNN, BBC, ABC, like the entire alphabet. And I couldn't, it literally didn't stop ringing. And I thought, okay, why did they suddenly pick up an interest in Gaza? And it's because now they saw it as non-threatening if you say the word genocide 100 times on air, because they would say that it's in the past tense, that it wouldn't have any implications, that the momentum will now disappear. But it disappeared, that media attention also disappeared shortly after, because they realized that Netanyahu has no intention of ending the genocide. When the bombing of Gaza started again, the media coverage was reduced. So the media coverage surges only when it's about putting the blame on Hamas or Palestinians killing Palestinians. It's very cynical and atrocious. In terms of what needs to be done, I would say, as Ardi and Heidi said, it takes a mix of both actions internationally, but also actions on the ground from Palestinians. If you look at South Africa's experience, it was a mix of armed resistance, nonviolent resistance, mass mobilization, and the international BDS campaign. Chomsky would always mention the fact that one of the reasons why apartheid South Africa collapsed was the military defeat that the Cuban army inflicted on the apartheid government in Angola. And that's when the pieces started to fall into place. And that's when all of it came together and the government was weakened sufficiently to concede its power. In our case, we need at least three elements that are currently absent. One is a unified Palestinian leadership. The other one is a clear national strategy, which includes something similar to the South African Freedom Charter. I was recently in a meeting with a senior South African official, and she said that their own struggle was completely paralyzed and dead between the years 1912 and 1953 until the Freedom Charter was written, because they relied in that 4-decade period, they relied on what they called moral persuasion, petitions going around different countries and trying to beg for mercy, beg for sympathy, trying to convince Britain not to buy diamond and gold from South Africa because it's immoral, but it didn't work. And they were deeply divided. But once you had a Freedom Charter, it's not necessarily sort of the magic pill that fixes everything, but it's an obligatory passage point, a necessary starting point to define your struggle in clear terms that would prevent its delegitimization. And an element of it was not only articulating the vision of the oppressed and what they want, but their vision on what's going to happen to the oppressor, to the white Afrikaners, and in our case, to Jewish Israelis, in order to not give any weapons to the complicit partners of apartheid to delegitimize your struggle. And the last point that was very important and lacking in our case is mass mobilization on the ground for Palestinians. I kept telling fellow Palestinians that once the genocide is over, or once Israel pretends that the genocide is over, our strategy for the last 2 years relied too much on showcasing our wounds, our naked trauma, our death and suffering in order to evoke anger and shock. But anger burns quickly, and shock, you have a function of the mind called hedonic adaptation that desensitizes you to the same shocking pictures if you see them 100 times, 1,000 times. And once Israel declares an end to the genocide, even if just nominally, the focus to sustain the momentum will no longer be on what Israel is doing, because Israel will pretend it's over. It will be on what we as Palestinians and pro-Palestinian solidarity groups are doing. What is it that we want? And how are we trying to get there? There was a time where the Palestinian struggle would not just create shock, anger, and sympathy, but it would inspire. At the times of Yasser Arafat, Arafat would go to India and you would have hundreds of thousands taking to the street to celebrate him. The same in Europe. We don't have that at the moment, but we have a stepping stone to get there, and you can help us with it. And that stepping stone is Marwan Barghouti. Right now, it is entirely insane to see Donald Trump, of all people, saying that he's thinking about pushing Israel to release Barghouti, and Canada has said nothing of the sort. France is the only country in the EU that behind closed doors has been advocating for Barghouti's release. But Barghouti is our Mandela. There's no time to qualify this argument, but he's the unifying figure that can bring Palestinians together, restore some resonance between the public and the leadership. And he's beating Hamas and Fatah in every poll. He's leading by a wide margin. He doesn't need to be an extraordinary individual, but you just need an individual that's constructed as a hero for the overwhelming majority of Palestinians to have a buy-in what he says, what he leads, to restore the spirit of sacrifice. In 2 years of the genocide in Gaza, the West Bank did not rise up sufficiently. And part of the reason is people there, they don't see a point in sacrificing their lives, their livelihoods for nothing, because they don't see a clear platform, a clear struggle, a clear strategy. They wouldn't sacrifice their lives for the Palestinian Authority or Mahmoud Abbas. They would need a unified movement that leads them. The other thing that you can help with is pushing for all the implications of recognizing Palestinian statehood. Number one is banning all settlement products and sanctioning all Israeli institutions that are complicit in the settlement areas in the occupied territory. The first of which would be sanctioning banks, financial institutions that have branches in the settlements. Even a discussion about this is frightening the Israelis. And the last element is something that the Israelis talk about very openly in Hebrew media daily that is terrifying to them, is the scenario of losing the visa exemption to come and visit Canada or Europe. Europe recently introduced an amendment in the EU Parliament whereby the visa exemption policy would be dictated in accordance with the human rights record of the countries that are exempted from a visa, that can visit the EU without needing to apply for a visa at all. If they apply this to Israel, Israel itself said if this is applied to us, we would lose immediately. We would lose the visa-free status. And it is entirely baffling that until now there's not even a discussion of this in either Europe or in Canada. The only person in the entire European continent that brought this up was Joseph Borrell, and that was after he left office, many months after he left office. Otherwise, the last thing I would recommend is try to reach out to people on the ground as much as possible in any capacity that you have, whether it's donation, whether it's convincing Canadian universities to offer scholarships or even remote education to people in Gaza, whether it's mentoring. There are programs like the We Are Not Numbers group in Gaza that helps young people with storytelling skills, with English language skills, with narrating their own stories. And it is the group that produced to us many names that have been very active, reporting on everything that's happening during the genocide to us in English. So volunteering some capacity there is important. And the last point is change is always slow until it's not. I learned that from many people that have been involved for decades in organizing, lobbying, creating movements on the ground. They said change is always painfully slow. You despair, you think nothing is going to change ever. And then like Syria, they were consumed by civil war for 14 years. And then seemingly overnight, Assad was toppled. So change is always slow until it's not. And one way that you can keep the change going is to keep showing up to demonstrations, keep speaking up, writing articles, etc. One even simpler way is to push back against microaggression with micro-solidarity. Just put on a Palestinian scarf, watermelon symbols, a Palestinian shirt. It doesn't mean much to you, maybe. It means a lot to any Palestinian on the street. It means even more to the Israelis. Israeli tourists, when they go to Canada or to Europe, the first thing they report on is the amount of Palestinian flags they saw, the amount of people wearing the Palestinian kufiya on the street. And for me personally, when I see people wearing this, it's not only heartwarming because you get a sense of community and belonging and being welcomed, but it's also a sense of physical assurance of my safety, that I can live in this place, I can walk on those streets without being afraid about people beating me up. Because that was the atmosphere that Palestinians in Europe, in Canada, felt right after October 7th. The rhetorics were very demonizing, aggressively dehumanizing us. If you had Biden at the time saying, those guys make Al Qaeda and ISIS look like angels. There was so much hate out there. And the main thing that took it away was the demonstrations, people showing up with a Palestinian kufiya, with a watermelon symbol, etc. So keep it up. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for a fantastic panel. Apologies for the late start, but folks, you more than made up for it with so much to take in, and I think we're all caught between pessimism and some optimism, and we need to hold on to that optimism. I think is one of the concluding messages, to keep struggling for human rights for Palestinians in this really critical stage. Ardi, you're jumping in. Did you want to add anything at the end?
I just want to say it's a Palestinian story. Read Amin Habibi, I'm the Pesa optimist. That's what it means to be a Palestinian. You have no choice. And I'll be honest with you, I've been doing this my whole life. And I don't ever recall a time in my life where the Palestinian people, their struggle, their story has been on the lips, the mouths, the minds of the world. Of course, all of this has come at a great cost. And it's an existential crisis that we face, and there's no denying that. And I don't want to downplay that at all. It's informed by that. But paradigm shifts happen at great moments of tumult. And I, for one, will not allow this moment to pass without at least trying to do my best to bring that paradigm shift about. And I should encourage all of you to do the same.
Couldn't say it better. Thank you, Ardi. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Muhammad. Like I said, we'll do our best to get this online, and look forward to engaging with you more in many different forums going forward. Thank you very much again for joining us at the University of Ottawa with the Laboratory for Engaged Research and the Human Rights Research and Education Center. Goodbye, everybody.